Chapter 24, Part 7 of Volume 3 of A Popular History of France from the Earliest Times. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Volume 3 of A Popular History of France from the Earliest Times by François Guizot. Translated by Robert Black. Chapter 24. The 100 Years' War. Charles VII and Joan of Arc, 1422 to 1462, Part 7. During the trial of Joan of Arc the war between France and England, without being discontinued, had been somewhat slack. The curiosity and the passions of men were concentrated upon the scenes at Rouen. After the execution of Joan the war resumed its course, though without any great events. By way of a step towards solution, the Duke of Bedford, in November 1431, escorted to Paris King Henry VI., scarcely 10 years old, and had him crowned at Notre Dame. The ceremony was distinguished for pomp, but not for warmth. The Duke of Burgundy was not present. It was an Englishman, the Cardinal Bishop of Winchester, who anointed the young Englander King of France. The Bishop of Paris complained of it as a violation of his rights. The Parliament, the University, and the municipal body had not even seats reserved at the royal banquet. Paris was melancholy, and day by day more deserted by the native inhabitants. Grass was growing in the courtyards of the great mansions; the students were leaving the great school of Paris, to which the Duke of Bedford, at Caen, and Charles VII. Himself, at Poitiers, were attempting to raise up rivals; and silence reigned in the Latin Quarter. The child king was considered unintelligent, and ungraceful, and ungracious. When, on the day after Christmas, he started on his way back to Rouen, and from Rouen to England, he did not confer on Paris any of the boons expected, either by releasing prisoners or by putting an end to blackmails, gabels, and wicked imposts. The burgesses were astonished, and grumbled; and the old queen, Isabel of Bavaria, who was still living at the hostel of St. Paul, wept, it is said, for vexation, at seeing from one of her windows her grandson's royal procession go by. Though war was going on all the while, attempts were made to negotiate, and in March 1433 a conference was opened at Seine-Port, near Corbeil. Everybody in France desired peace. Philip the Good himself began to feel the necessity of it. Burgundy was almost as discontented and troubled as Ile-de-France. There was grumbling at Dijon as there was conspiracy at Paris. The English gave fresh cause for national irritation. They showed an inclination to canton themselves in Normandy, and abandon the other French provinces to the hazards and sufferings of a desultory war. Anne of Burgundy, the Duke of Bedford's wife, and Philip the Good's sister, died. The English duke speedily married again without even giving any notice to the French prince. Every family tie between the two persons was broken, and the negotiations as well as the war remained without result. An incident at court caused a change in the situation, and gave the government of Charles a different character. His favorite, George de la Tremoille, had become almost as unpopular amongst the royal family as in the country in general. He could not manage a war, and he frustrated attempts at peace. The Queen of Sicily, Yolande d'Aragon, her daughter, Mary d'Anjou, Queen of France, and her son Louis, Count of Maine, who all three desired peace, set themselves to work to overthrow the favorite. In June 1433 four young lords, one of whom, Sire de Bouille, was La Tremoille's own nephew, introduced themselves unexpectedly into his room at the castle of Coudray, near Chinon, where Charles VII. Was. La Tremoille showed an intention of resisting, and received a sword thrust. He was made to resign all his offices, and was sent under strict guard to the castle of Alen-Tresour, the property of his nephew, Sire de Bouille. The conspirators had concerted measures with La Tremoille's rival, the Constable de Richemont, Arthur of Brittany, a man distinguished in war, who had lately gone to help Joan of Arc, and who was known to be a friend of peace at the same time that he was firmly devoted to the national cause. He was called away from his castle of Parthenay, and set at the head of government as well as of the army. Charles VII. At first showed anger at his favorite's downfall. He asked if Richemont was present, and was told no, whereupon he seemed to grow calmer. Before long he did more; he became resigned, and, continuing all the while to give La Tremoille occasional proofs of his former favor, he fully accepted de Richemont's influence and the new direction which the constable imposed upon his government. War was continued nearly everywhere, with alternations of success and reverse which deprived none of the parties of hope without giving victory to any. Peace, however, was more and more the general desire. Scarcely had one attempt at pacification failed when another was begun. The Constable de Richemont's return to power led to fresh overtures. He was a statesman as well as a warrior, and his inclinations were known at Dijon and London, as well as at Chinon. The advisers of King Henry VI. Proposed to open a conference, on the 15th of October, 1433, at Calais. They had, they said, a prisoner in England, confined there ever since the battle of Agincourt, Duke Charles of Orleans, who was sincerely desirous of peace, in spite of his family enmity towards the Duke of Burgundy. He was considered a very proper person to promote the negotiations, although he sought in poetry, which was designed to bring lustre to his name, a refuge from politics which made his life a burden. He, one day meeting the Duke of Burgundy's two ambassadors at the Earl of Suffolk's, Henry VI. Prime Minister, went up to them, affectionately took their hands, and, when they inquired after his health, said, "My body is well, my soul is sick. I am dying with vexation at passing my best days a prisoner, without any one to think of me." The ambassadors said that people would be indebted to him for the benefit of peace, for he was known to be laboring for it. "My Lord of Suffolk," said he, "can I tell you that I never cease to urge it upon the king and his council; but I am as useless here as the sword never drawn from the scabbard. I must see my relatives and friends in France; they will not treat, surely, without having consulted with me. If peace depended upon me, though I were doomed to die 7 days after swearing it, that would cause me no regret. However, what matters it what I say? I am not master in anything at all. Next to the two kings, it is the Duke of Burgundy and the Duke of Brittany who have most power. Will you not come and call upon me?" he added, pressing the hand of one of the ambassadors. "They will see you before they go," said the Earl of Suffolk, in a tone which made it plain that no private conversation would be permitted between them. And, indeed, the Earl of Suffolk's barber went alone to wait upon the ambassadors, in order to tell them that, if the Duke of Burgundy desired it, the Duke of Orleans would write to him. "I will undertake," he added, "to bring you his letter." There was evident mistrust, and it was explained to the Burgundian ambassadors by the Earl of Warwick's remark, "Your duke never once came to see our king during his stay in France." The Duke of Bedford used similar language to them. "Why," said he, "does my brother the Duke of Burgundy give way to evil imaginings against me? There is not a prince in the world, after my king, whom I esteem so much. The ill will which seems to exist between us spoils the king's affairs, and his own too. Tell him that I am not the less disposed to serve him." In March, 1435, the Duke of Burgundy went to Paris, taking with them his third wife, Isabel of Portugal, and a magnificent following. There were seen, moreover, in his train, 100 wagons laden with artillery, armor, salted provisions, cheeses, and wines of Burgundy. There was once more joy in Paris, and the duke received the most affectionate welcome. The University was represented before him, and made him a great speech on the necessity of peace. 2 days afterwards a deputation from the city dames of Paris waited upon the Duchess of Burgundy, and implored her to use her influence for the re establishment of peace. She answered, "My good friends, it is the thing I desire most of all in the world. I pray for it night and day to the Lord our God, for I believe that we all have great need of it; and I know for certain that my lord and husband has the greatest willingness to give up to that purpose his person and his substance." At the bottom of his soul Duke Philip's decision was already taken. He had but lately discussed the condition of France with the Constable de Richemont and Duke Charles of Bourbon, his brother in law, whom he had summoned to Nevers with that design. Being convinced of the necessity for peace, he spoke of it to the King of England's advisers whom he found in Paris, and who dared not show absolute opposition to it. It was agreed that, in the month of July, a general, and, more properly speaking, a European conference should meet at Arras, that the legates of Pope Eugenius IV. Should be invited to it, and that consultations should be held thereat as to the means of putting an end to the sufferings of the two kingdoms. Towards the end of July, accordingly, whilst the war was being prosecuted with redoubled ardor on both sides at the very gates of Paris, there arrived at Arras the pope's legates and the ambassadors of the Emperor Sigismund, of the kings of Castile, Aragon, Portugal, Naples, Sicily, Cyprus, Poland, and Denmark, and of the dukes of Brittany and Milan. The University of Paris and many of the good towns of France, Flanders, and even Holland had sent their deputies thither. Many bishops were there in person. The Bishop of Liege came thither with a magnificent train, mounted, says the chroniclers, on 200 white horses. The Duke of Burgundy made his entrance on the 30th of July, escorted by 300 archers wearing his livery. All the lords who happened to be in the city went to meet him at a league's distance, except the cardinal legates of the pope, who confined themselves to sending their people. 2 days afterwards arrived the ambassadors of the King of France, having at their head the Duke of Bourbon and the Constable de Richemont, together with several of the greatest French lords, and a retinue of 400 or 500 persons. Duke Philip, forewarned of their coming, issued from the city with all the princes and lords who happened to be there. The English alone refused to accompany him, wondering at his showing such a great honor to the ambassadors of their common enemy. Philip went forward a mile to meet his two brothers in law, the Duke of Bourbon and the Count de Richemont, embraced them affectionately, and turned back with them to Arras, amidst the joy and acclamations of the populace. Last of all arrived the Duchess of Burgundy, magnificently dressed, and bringing with her her young son, the Count of Charolais, who was hereafter to be Charles the Rash. The Duke of Bourbon, the Constable de Richemont, and all the lords were on horseback around her litter; but the English, who had gone, like the others, to meet her, were unwilling, on turning back to Arras, to form a part of her retinue with the French. Grand as was the sight, it was not superior in grandeur to the event on the eve of accomplishment. The question was whether France should remain a great nation, in full possession of itself and of its independence under a French king, or whether the King of England should, in London and with the title of King of France, have France in his possession and under his government. Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy, was called upon to solve this problem of the future, that is to say, to decide upon the fate of his lineage and his country. As soon as the conference was opened, and no matter what attempts were made to veil or adjourn the question, it was put nakedly. The English, instead of peace, began proposing a long truce, and the marriage of Henry VI. With a daughter of King Charles. The French ambassadors refused, absolutely, to negotiate on this basis; they desired a definitive peace, and their conditions were, that the king and people of England making an end of this situation, so full of clangor for the whole royal house, and of the sufferings for the people. Nevertheless the duke showed strong scruples. The treaty he had sworn to, the promises he had made, threw him into a constant fever of anxiety; he would not have any one able to say that he had in any respect forfeited his honor. He asked for 3 consultations, one with the Italian doctors connected with the pope's legates, another with the English doctors, and another with the French doctors. He was granted all 3, though they were more calculated to furnish him with arguments, each on their own side, than to dissipate his doubts if he had any real ones. The legates ended by solemnly saying to him, "We do conjure you, by the bowels of our Lord Jesus Christ, and by the authority of our Holy Father the Pope, of the Holy Council assembled at Bale, and of the universal Church, to renounce that spirit of vengeance whereby you are moved against King Charles in memory of the late Duke John your father. Nothing can render you more pleasing in the eyes of God, or further augment your fame in this world." For 3 days Duke Philip remained still undecided; but he heard that the Duke of Bedford, regent of France, on behalf of the English, who was his brother in law, had just died at Rouen, on the 14th of September. He was, besides the late King of England, Henry V., the only Englishman who had received promises from the duke, and who lived in intimacy with him. 10 days afterwards, on the 21st of September, the queen, Isabel of Bavaria, also died at Paris; and thus another of the principal causes of shame to the French kingship, and misfortune to France, disappeared from the stage of the world. Duke Philip felt himself more free and more at rest in his mind, if not rightfully, at any rate so far as political and worldly experience was concerned. He declared his readiness to accept the proposals which had been communicated to him by the ambassadors of Charles VII., and on the 21st of September, 1435, peace was signed at Arras between France and Burgundy, without any care for what England might say or do. There was great and general joy in France. It was peace, and national reconciliation as well; Dauphinizers and Burgundians embraced in the streets. The Burgundians were delighted at being able to call themselves Frenchmen. Charles VII. Convoked the states general at Tours, to consecrate this alliance. On his knees, upon the bare stone, before the Archbishop of Crete, who had just celebrated mass, the king laid his hands upon the Gospels, and swore the peace, saying that it was his duty to imitate the King of kings, our divine Saviour, who had brought peace amongst men. At the chancellor's order, the princes and great lords, one after the other, took the oath; the nobles and the people of the third estate swore the peace all together, with cries of "Long live the king! Long live the Duke of Burgundy!" "With this hand," said Sire de Lannoy, "I have thrice sworn peace during this war; but I call God to witness that, for my part, this time it shall be kept, and that never will I break it, the peace." Charles VII., in his emotion, seized the hands of Duke Philip's ambassadors, saying, "For a long while I have languished for this happy day; we must thank God for it;" and the Te Deum was intoned with enthusiasm. Peace was really made amongst Frenchmen; and, in spite of many internal difficulties and quarrels, it was not broken as long as Charles VII. And Duke Philip the Good were living. But the war with the English went on incessantly. They still possessed several of the finest provinces of France; and the treaty of Arras, which had weakened them very much on the Continent, had likewise made them very angry. For 26 years, from 1435 to 1461, hostilities continued between the two kingdoms, at one time actively and at another slackly, with occasional suspension by truce, but without any formal termination. There is no use in recounting the details of their monotonous and barren history. Governments and people often persist in maintaining their quarrels and inflicting mutual injuries by the instrumentality of events, acts, and actors that deserve nothing but oblivion. There is no intention here of dwelling upon any events or persons save such as have, for good or for evil, to its glory or sorrow, exercised a considerable influence upon the condition and fortune of France. Chapter 24.